We're going to begin Chapter 12 in 21st Century Geometry with a review of some algebra concepts that you really must be able to do here in Chapter 12. To begin with, we have to be able to solve equations. We've done quite a bit of this already, so this should go pretty easily. Here we'd have to distribute the 8x minus 40 equals 6x minus 16. We have x's on both sides, so let's subtract and move all of them to one side. I'm going to move everything to the left side, so I'll subtract the 6x. I get 2x minus 40 equals negative 16. Then we'll add the 40. 2x will equal 24. We divide by 2, and x is 12. Let's try another of these. Now this one, we have to remember when we have that negative in front of the parenthesis, it's like a -1 there that needs to be distributed. So we'd have 167 minus 7x minus 3 equals 108. The 167 and the minus 3 would combine as like terms. Negative 7x plus 164 equals 108. We'll subtract the 164 on both sides. We'll have negative 7x equals negative 56. We divide by negative 7. X works out to be 8. On the next problem, the technique that I want to review with you is, if you have a denominator such as this 2, I would strongly recommend you eliminate the fraction by multiplying both sides by that denominator. On the left side, it would just cancel, leaving what's on the top, 3x plus 15 plus 11x minus 5 equals, and 2 times 47 is 94. Once again, we have to get rid of those parentheses. This is like a +1 that we're going to distribute. When we distribute that, we'd have 3x plus 15 plus 11x minus 5 equals 94. Combining the like terms, 3x and 11x is 14x. 15 minus 5 is 10. Subtracting 10 on both sides gives us 14x equals 84. Dividing by 14, x would be 6. Here we have another one of these that involves a fraction. So again, I would recommend that we eliminate the fraction by multiplying by a 2 on both sides. Of course, on the left side, that would mean we'd have to distribute the 2. So that would give us 4x minus 14. On the right side, the 2 cancels, and we just have the top. 8x minus 47 minus, and then the 3x minus 14. We have that situation where we have a negative in front again, so we'll have to distribute the -1. So 4x minus 14 equals 8x minus 47, and then minus 3x and plus 14. -1 times -14 is plus 14. There's like terms on the right side, so we'll combine those like terms on the right side. 8x minus 3x is 5x. -47 plus 14, -33. We have more x's on the right side, so we'll subtract 4x. -14 equals x minus 33. And then we'll add 33 to both sides, and we get x equals 19. Now, those were fairly straightforward problems. They're what we call linear problems because the x was to the first power, but I wanted to make sure that we were good and solid on those, because those will definitely show up in this chapter. The rest of the review here is going to deal with quadratics, and we're going to review many things to do with quadratics. The first thing we're going to review here is multiplying binomials. Many of you will have learned this using a technique called FOIL. FOIL stands for first, outside, inside, last. First means we take the first one in this parenthesis times the first one in that one. 3x times x, 3x squared. Outside means we take the ones furthest from each other. So 3x times 6, 18x. Inside means we take the two that are closest to each other. -5 times x, -5x. And last means we take the last one in the first group times the last one in the second group, -30. These two are like terms, so we'll combine those together. 18x minus 5x gives us 13x and minus 30. This would be our answer after we multiplied those together. Number 6, we are squaring a binomial. To square something means to multiply it times itself. So we actually have a 4x plus 3 times a second 4x plus 3. And we will use that same FOIL concept that we just reviewed. First times first, 4x times 4x would give me 16x squared. Outside's 4x times 3 gives me 12x. Inside's 3 times 4x would give me another 12x. And last, 3 times 3 gives me 9. Yet again, these are like terms. 16x squared plus 24x plus 9. Let's do the reverse of multiplying. And this is called factoring. This first one is something called a general trinomial. In a general trinomial, you're actually trying to undo a FOIL process. You make 2 sets of parentheses. We need to have 2 things that multiply to give us x squared. That's x times x. They go in the front positions. We need 2 things that multiply to give us 21, and they have to add up to 10. 7 times 3. 7 and 3. We wish to get a positive 10 in the middle, so both would have to be positive. And this would be our answer when we factor those 2. The next one, another general trinomial. So yet again, we make 2 sets of parentheses. In the first positions, we have to get x squared, so it's x times x. In the last position, we need things that multiply to give us 36, but they also have to subtract to give us 16. So we're going to have to use 2 times 18. I'll put the 2 here and the 18 here. And I'm going to have a positive 18 and a negative 2. Now, number 9 is actually a special case. This was a special case called the difference of 2 squares. It was a pattern that you learned and memorized in Algebra 1. And it said, if you have this pattern where you have an a squared minus a b squared, a perfect square, subtraction, and another perfect square. It's 2 grouping symbols. The square root of the front one goes here, and the square root of the back one goes here. Always have 1 plus and 1 minus. So for the problem that we're trying to do here, we'll have to make 2 sets of parentheses. To get our x squared, we need x and x. To get 64, we need 8 and 8. One has to be plus and one has to be minus. And that's a special pattern you learned in Algebra 1 that you will have to use. What we're going to use this factoring for is, of course, solving equations. So let's do some solve by factoring. Whenever we solve by factoring, it must be equal to 0. So number 10 is ready to go. We'll go ahead and factor it. To get x squared, I need x and x. To get 20, I need things that multiply to give me 20 and add up to 9, 4 and 5. To get a negative 9, they both have to be negative. Because we are solving, we have to set each of those factors equal to 0. And we end up with 2 answers. In number 11, the first thing we have to do is we must get it equal to 0. So we're going to have to move that 135 over. X squared plus 6x minus 135 equals 0. and that's what we have to factor. Well, we'll make our two sets of parentheses. The front ones are pretty easy. They're x and x. The back ones have to multiply to give me 135 and subtract to give me 6. So things that multiply to give me 135 and subtract to give me 6, 15 times 9. I'll put, sorry about that. I'll put the 15 here and the 9 here. I need a positive in the middle, so I'll put positive 50 and negative 9. We set each of those factors equal to 0. We end up with x equals negative 15 and x equals positive 9. The last one, solving by factoring, we're going to need to move everything over so that we have 0 on one side. If I want 0 on one side, I have to move both the x and the 24. So I would have x squared minus 10x minus 24 equals 0. Now comes the factoring. To get x squared, of course, we need x and x. To multiply to 24 and subtract to give me 10, I'll have to use 12 and 2. And to get a negative 10, I need a negative on the 12 and a positive on the 2. And we'll set each one of those equal to 0. X minus 12 equals 0. X plus 2 equals 0. Here we add 12 to get that answer. Here we subtract 2 to get that answer. And that's done. So one of the techniques you'll use to solve quadratics is solving by factoring. Let's review a second technique you learned back in Algebra 1. And this is called solving using square roots. In this process, we try to isolate the squared term. The second thing that we do is we take the square root of both sides. And then the third thing we do is we finish solving. Okay, let's try a problem using this solving by square roots method. To isolate the x squared, I have to subtract 8 on both sides. X squared equals 25. Now we take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of 25, you get two answers. X equals 5 and x equals negative 5. There are two answers. Let's try number 14. So in number 14, we're going to add the 18 on both sides. We'll divide by 2. And then once again, we take the square root of both sides. We get two answers. We get x equals 3 and x equals negative 3. Do not use the plus or minus sign. Let's try this last one in this section. So for this last one, we have to move this to the other side. So we'll add 49 over 64. And then we will take the square root of both sides. We end up with x equals, the square root of 49 is 7, the square root of 64 is 8. And then we also have negative 7 over 8. Always box your answers. Okay, we have one less method of solving quadratic equations to review, and that's the quadratic formula. And you memorize this. In Algebra 1, and you'll need to know it now. First thing we do is we pick out the A and the B and the C. A is the 3, B is the -8. C is the +2. We put that into this formula. We have the negative of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times the A. You'll notice the division bar goes all the way under the negative B. What I would encourage you to do is to work out what's under the square root sign first. So we have a negative of -8 just gives us 8 plus or minus square root of 40, all divided by 6. There are two possibilities here. The first possibility is when we use the minus sign. X equals 8 minus the square root of 40, all over 6. The other possibility is when we use the plus sign. X equals 8 plus the square root of 40, all over 6. They ask us here to round to the nearest hundredth. When you put it in your calculator, you must put a parenthesis around the whole top. If we work out that whole top one using the negative sign, we get x equals 0.28. If we work out the bottom one, and again, do not forget those parentheses, we end up with x equals 2.39. Again, two answers, and you must box your answers. Let's try another of these. So yet again, we're going to use the quadratic formula, and you must know this. In this problem, the A is 1, the B is 6, and the C is -5. Putting it into the formula, we'd have x equals -b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times A times C, all of that, the whole thing, divided by 2 times the A. Working out what's underneath the square root sign, we have -6 plus or minus, comes out to be a square root of 56. Again, two possibilities. One is when we use the minus, -6 minus the square root of 56, all of that over 2. The other is when we use the plus, -6 plus the square root of 56, all over 2. Yet again, we are rounding to the nearest hundredth. When you put it in the calculator, don't forget parentheses around the whole top. So for the top one, when we use the minus sign, we get x equals -6.74. For the bottom one, when we use the plus sign, we get x equals 0.74. And that's the quadratic formula. Now, this is probably the most complicated thing we're reviewing, so I'd like to do a few more of these with you. Number 18 must be equal to 0. So we're going to have to move that over. That will give us x squared plus 12x minus 7 equals 0. Now we pick out the A and the B and the C. And then we put it into our formula. -b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times the A. Working out what's beneath the square root sign, that's called the radicand, the part that's under there, we end up with 172. And then, of course, we split it into two possibilities. One is when we use the minus, -12 minus square root of 172, all over 2. The other is when we use the plus sign, -12 plus the square root, 172, all over 2. And do not forget when you put it into the calculator to put a parenthesis around the whole top. On the top one, when we use the minus sign and we round to the nearest hundredth, we get x equals -12.56. On the bottom one, when we use the plus sign, we get x equals 0.56. Take a look at that carefully, see if it makes sense. Watch it a couple times. Let's try another one. Now, quite often in this chapter, we're going to be dealing with very, very large numbers. Again, we have to have it set equal to 0, so we must move that over. X squared plus 234x minus 642 equals 0. The A is 1, the B is 234, and the C is negative 642. Putting it into our quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root, then the b squared minus 4 times the a times the c, all of that, even the negative b, divided by 2 times the a. Let's work out what's in that radicand, the part under the square root sign. Negative 234 plus or minus the square root, and that comes out to be 57,324. All of that is still divided by 2. And now is where we split it into the two parts. The one part uses the negative, negative 234 minus the square root, 57,324 divided by 2. The other uses the positive, x equals negative 234 plus the square root, 57,324, all divided by 2. And again, constant reminder, don't forget when you put it in the calculator to put parentheses around the whole top and the whole bottom. It looks like this top one, if we go to the nearest hundredth, will give us negative 236.71. The bottom one, to the nearest hundredth, would give us 2.71. One last example using this quadratic formula. And these big numbers should not cause an issue because you're going to be using a calculator anyway. So we'll subtract this to move it over. X squared plus 320x minus 525 equals 0. A is 1, B is 320, C is negative 525. Putting it into the formula, negative b plus or minus the square root, b squared minus 4 times the a times the c, all divided by 2 times the a. Notice the division bar goes all the way under the negative b as well. Underneath that square root sign, in the radicand, we end up with 104,500. 104,500. And now it becomes split into the two pieces, one using the negative, negative 320 minus the square root, 104,500, all divided by 2. The other using the positive, x equals negative 320 plus the square root, 104,500, all divided by 2. For the top one, rounding to the nearest hundredth yet again, I get negative 321.63. For the bottom one, I get positive 1.63. All of these algebra techniques will be used in this chapter. All of them you have to know how to do as part of your geometry problems. So if you have to come back to this and review it, please do review it. If you have to watch it a few times, please do that as well, because you'll need all of these skills. Okay, I hope it goes well for you. Remember, the help times are 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock each day. And if you have any questions, just join me in Teams. I hope things are going well.